The Sons of Dawn have got their new book, so grab your bolter and prepare to break the siege as we look at the new Imperial Fists Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-based 40k channel, where we've been looking at everything Space Marine over the last few weeks. We've already had a look at the Salamander's new Codex today, so I thought we'd move straight on and look at the Imperial Fists. Now, from having a quick look over these rules, I can tell that this is going to be a very, very scary army to face on the tabletop. They're going to have a hideous amount of bolt weapon fire, and I'm looking forward to having a really good look into them to see what sort of combos we can make with all of these new options. In this review, we're going to take a look at the contents of this book, the Warlord traits, Stratagems, Psychic powers, Relics, and special characters, and we're going to look at both the Imperial Fists and the Crimson Fists, who are both present in this book as Sons of Dawn. Now, the Imperial Fists are the siege specialists of the Adeptus Astartes. They're a loyal and stubborn chapter that are tasked with the defence of Terra against the waves of chaos and Xenos that pervade the Imperium. They're a mobile and fleet-based chapter. Their fortress monastery, the Phalanx, has been pivotal in several major galactic events, most recently when it showed up at the Fall of Cadia to fight against Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. But now let's get into how these bolter-wielding siege specialists perform on the tabletop. The Imperial Fists themselves have the Siege Masters chapter tactic. When you're resolving an attack with a model with this tactic, if you shoot it with a bolt weapon, such as a heavy bolter or a bolt gun, then rolls of 6 score an additional hit. So if you're hitting on a 3-up with your bolt weapon, then that will usually translate to being a 25% buff in damage. And that's really not too bad, seeing as it's entirely army-wide, essentially for free. It means that bolt weapons have a lot more value in the hands of an Imperial Fist compared with some other chapters. The second part is that enemy units do not receive the benefit of cover to their saving throw when they're being attacked by models with this ability. So those are 2 very nice little shooting buffs wrapped into one there. The extra shots with bolt weapons, I'd say, is the main part of the ability. Ignoring cover is certainly very useful, and in some matchups it will be very, very big indeed. Say, for example, if you're playing against Raven Guard and all of their units count as being in cover if they're greater than 12 inches away. But it'll matter less in some other matchups, say against Orcs or Imperial Knights, for example. Crimson Fists, on the other hand, have a chapter tactic called No Matter the Odds. They retain the same special rule boosting bolt weaponry, so 6s count as 2 hits, but their second buff comes into play against hordes. So if a Crimson Fist unit attacks an enemy infantry squad that has at least 5 more models than the firing unit, then they get +1 to hit. For the purposes of this tactic, a Crimson Fist vehicle counts as 5 models. So essentially their vehicles will be +1 to hit if they're firing at a unit that's 10 models or more. Their characters, if they're firing at 6 models or more, and say a 5-man squad, again will get a bonus to hit if they're shooting at a 10-man squad or more. Again, this is quite specific. It's really helpful in some matchups, really not in other matchups. +1 to hit is a very, very good bonus, and does amount to another 25% buff to your final damage output when it's applied to a model with a 3-up ballistic skill. I think both of them have their merits, and it really depends on the rest of the meta as to what you're most worried about and would like the buff against. I would personally probably choose the Imperial Fists out of the 2, as I feel that the meta is shifting a bit more towards elite units, and Space Marines don't generally have too much trouble dealing with hordes anyway, because they'll be throwing a massive amount of bolt weapons around. Now, new for this book is the boosted Devastator Doctrine that we've seen previewed, the Legacy of Dawn. So while in Devastator Doctrine, and you resolve an attack made with a heavy weapon against a vehicle or building, you add 1 to the damage characteristic of that weapon for that attack. This makes your heavy bolters damage 2 against vehicles and buildings, your las cannons will be d6 +1, your autocannon variants will be damage 3. This again is a very, very powerful but tailored buff that will be absolutely devastating in some matchups and has the potential to be completely useless in others. As I discussed in my video when the rules for this were leaked, I think that this tactic pushes you in favour of high rate of fire weapons, such as lots and lots of heavy bolters to synergise with the chapter tactics. The heavy bolters have their power doubled against vehicles because they were only 1 damage before, and if you have loads of heavy bolters, then it doesn't really matter if this doesn't come into effect, because you'll have lots and lots of shots to deal with infantry anyway. I do feel that this buff does have some holes though. Say for example, if you're fighting Tau Riptide spam, this will do absolutely nothing to help you gun down those very tough Riptides. And the same for say Tyranid monstrous creatures, or Chaos monster lists, say running a bunch of Demon Princes. That being said, this is an incredibly strong buff. Having +1 to damage characteristics in any form across an entire army is absolutely amazing. Let's take a look at the special characters now, and we have 3 in the book. For Imperial Fists we have Tor Garadon and Captain Lysander, and for Crimson Fists we have Pedro Kantor. I've already covered Tor Garadon in a separate video, so I'll just go over his stats quickly. If you'd like to check that video out, please feel free to, as I've gone a little bit more in depth in that than I will here. Essentially, he's a 140 point character with a Primaris Captain stat line and an enormous Power Fist that gives him strength ×3 and a flat 3 damage. He's got a Signum array that provides 1 nearby Imperial Fists unit with a 2-up ballistic skill, which is a very nice further buff to shooting, and he's also equipped with a grav gun. He's very tough with 7 wounds and very fighty with 5 attacks. He has an ability called Siege Captain, which gives him an additional +1 damage against vehicles, so with that enormous Power Fist he'll be doing a flat 4 damage against vehicles, which is very very nice indeed. I think I could see this guy happily sitting in the midst of an Imperial Fist gun line, perhaps with some intercessors advancing towards the enemy so he can get into close combat and destroy anything that comes to threaten the intercessors. His warlord trait is Siege Master, which will give him an extra +1 to wound against vehicles. He can do a significant amount of damage to a knight. I think it averages something between 12 and 16 wounds in a single round of combat, so is certainly not one to be underestimated. Captain Lysander is a 130 point model who's clad in Terminator armour and has the standard Space Marine Captain in Terminator armour profile, so he's got 6 wounds, 4 attacks, a 2-up save and a 3-up invul save. His special hammer, the Fist of Dawn, is a thunder hammer with strength +6 and a flat 3 damage, and it doesn't have any modifier to the hit, so he will be happily hitting on 2-ups, rerolling 1s with this thing. He has the special rule Icon of Obstinacy, which means that when a morale test is taken for a unit within 6 inches of him, no more than 1 model can flee, which is a bit redundant in a Space Marine Codex where everything's got good morale. That being said, for his points, he's really quite a good character. He's essentially a smash captain that will drop down, hit with strength 10, not have a -1 to hit with his thunder hammer, and is cheaper than a thunder hammer storm shield Terminator captain would be normally. So he's very fighty and fairly tough to remove. The only issue will be getting him into close combat, as he is a bit slow, and unless you use a chaplain to give him +2 to his charge after he drops in, he might well fail his charge out of deep strike. Finally, for the Crimson Fist, we have Pedro Kantor, who is a very very good character for his points in my opinion. He costs 150 points, and he's gained a lot of ability with this new book. He essentially has the profile of a Space Marine Captain who has been upgraded to a Chapter Master. He has 5 attacks at base now, and that will be improved to 6 with his aura to give friendly Crimson Fist models +1 attack when they're within 6 inches of him. He's armed with a Power Fist, and Dawn's Arrow, a special Storm Bolter that has Assault 4, Strength 4, AP -1, and 2 damage, which is also an improvement on his previous incarnation. His Chapter Master style rerolls within 6 inches have got the same buff that all Chapter Master style rerolls have, so that's now regardless of modifiers. So if an Eldar Flyer, for example, is making you hit on a 5-up, you can reroll everything that isn't just those 5s, so it's really helpful against those negative to hit shenanigans. All in all, he's a very powerful little gunline buffing character. Just getting the Chapter Master rerolls without having to pay 2 CP for them is very positive. He's got a reasonable melee stat line, decent shooting, and if the enemy do get close enough to threaten your lines, then that +1 attack is going to be absolutely brutal, particularly in combination with those Chapter Master rerolls. If you're playing Crimson Fists, I would certainly be considering him, as he's very very good value for the points. Now let's move on to take a look at Warlord traits. First up we have Siege Master. This allows your Warlords to add 1 to wound rolls against buildings and vehicle units. This is the one that Tor Garadon gets, and it's pretty good for any character that is expecting to get in close and personal with enemy vehicles. Probably best on things like Smash Captains with a Junk Pack and Thunderhammer, but wouldn't be unreasonable to throw it on Tor Garadon himself. to allow him to really mess up any encroaching enemy vehicles on the Imperial Fists lines. Second, we have Indomitable. This makes the Warlord not able to be wounded on more than a 4-up, regardless of the enemy weapon's strength, so is a fairly decent little survivability buff to your Warlord. You can stack this with other defensive buffs to make a very, very tough character, though in general I prefer Warlord traits that can improve the damage output of the character, or improve his buffing ability, so I'm not sure I'd take this one myself. Next we have Fleet Master. This is a once per battle ability to inflict a bunch of mortal wounds on the enemy. Essentially you nominate a point on the battlefield that your Warlord can see, you roll a d6, and enemy units within that far of the point that you've nominated take d3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 4-up. So a lot of random dice rolling there, but that's actually really quite a powerful ability. I could easily see this being brought in as hero of the chapter, just to potentially inflict 2 or 3 smites on a bunched up enemy army. I definitely like this one, and I think that it's a lot better than other similar abilities of its type, because you can buy it in for only 1 command point. Next up we have Stubborn Heroism. This basically means that the Warlord halves incoming damage, so say a damage 4 weapon would only do 2 damage to the Warlord if they failed their saving throw. This adds a lot of survivability to your Warlord, and you can use the Imperial Fist stratagem to take 2 Imperial Fist Warlord traits to combo this with Indomitable to make a very, very hard to remove character. The only downside of this one is that you can't fall back with your Warlord, and this could really be quite bad indeed if, say, he got in combat with a horde and you needed to fall back to shoot the horde with lots of bolters. So definitely one to look out for. You could wind up making a mistake with this in the wrong circumstances. Next we have Architect of War. This buffs friendly Imperial Fist units within 6 inches, and it means that they ignore AP-1 modifiers for saving throws while they're in cover. So essentially if you shoot a heavy bolter with AP-1 against some Imperial Fist intercessors in cover, then those intercessors will still be saving on a 2-up. So a nice little durability boost there. And finally we have Hand of Dawn, which is simple and effective. If your army is battle forged, gain d3 command points before the battle. This is good in that it's only positive. If you have this as your standard Warlord, essentially it just means that you're starting the game with on average 2 more command points than you would be normally. If you're not choosing to buy in another Warlord trait with Hero of the Chapter, then you should absolutely definitely buy this in for 1 CP, because if you roll a 2 or 3 on that d3, then you've just gained 1 or 2 command points for free. You literally can't lose with this one. All in all, I quite like the Warlord traits. There's some powerful defensive buffs, decent attacking buffs, an interesting once per game mortal wound weapon, and if all else fails, just a couple of extra CP. I think you can make arguments for literally every one of these Warlord traits. Now let's move on to the Crimson Fists Warlord traits. Firstly we have Refuse to Die. This means that when your Warlord is slain, roll a dice. On a 4-up, he returns to life at the end of the phase, and he has d3 wounds remaining. This could be good to save your fighty character in a pinch. Could be a good one to throw on a Suicide Smash Captain, so he could potentially get straight back up and go for another round of smashing things up the next turn. Just make sure you've got a command reroll to reroll that 4-up get back up roll, just in case you happen to roll low. Next we have Tenacious Opponent. The Warlord gains d3 additional attacks if there are at least 5 enemy models within 6 inches of them when they're chosen to fight. Could turn your Warlord into a real blender. Throw this on a Jump Captain with the Teeth of Terror. Throw him into a horde of orcs, and on average you'll be hitting with 10 attacks, which of course you can pay more CP to fight twice with should you desire. And finally we have Stoic Defender. Friendly Crimson Fist units within 6 inches of the Warlord gain Defenders of Humanity, which is essentially the objective secured rule, and if they already have that, then they count as 2 models for those purposes. I find this somewhat underwhelming. I think your Warlord's not often going to be on a hotly contested objective where both you and your enemy models are there, and this might not even take the objective even if they are. So I personally wouldn't bother with this one, it's just a bit too situational. Let's go on to Relics now. First we'll talk about the Relics of the Imperial Fists, then go on to the Crimson Fist, then the Special Issue War Gear. So the Imperial Fists have the Spartian, which is a big bolt pistol essentially. It's got an 18-inch range, 2 shots, strength 4, AP-3, 2 damage, and you can target characters even if they aren't the closest. It's not a bad little damage upgrade, but I certainly wouldn't take this when you could take something like the Teeth of Terror or The Burning Blade from the main Codex. Relic bolt pistols always seem to be a bit underwhelming really. Next we have the Banner of Lysander. This is an upgrade banner for an Ancient, and it allows you to add 1 to hit rolls in the fight phase for Imperial Fists units within 6 inches. This could be potentially useful if you are advancing a horde of intercessors towards the enemy army, and you are taking an Ancient anyway to allow them to shoot when they died. If you are doing that sort of tactic though, I'd be very strongly tempted to take the Banner of the Emperor Ascendant for that 9-inch fight when you die or shoot when you die rule instead of this, as I think it will probably be more useful. This certainly does offer a different option though, and incentivises you to get into close combat a little bit more. Next we have a very, very good relic, which is the Eye of Hypnoth, which I believe is the one from the Siegebreaker cohort, unless I'm getting things muddled. This basically gives you the power of a lieutenant, but it only works in the shooting phase. I think that this is a really, really good relic, as it can essentially mean that you don't have to pay for a 65 points lieutenant to buff your gun line. You can just take a captain or chapter master, give them this relic, and essentially one character can do both jobs and you've saved 65 points. Just need to make sure that all-important buffing character is nice and safe. Wouldn't want any snipers getting to him. Finally we have the Bones of Ozrak, a librarian relic, which means that you can re-roll psychic tests when you're casting a geokinesis power. So it's certainly something that you can consider if you want a librarian that's a little bit more reliable. If it saves you a command reroll on an important psychic power sometime in the battle, then it could certainly be worth it. Next we have the Relics of the Crimson Fists, of which there are just 2. There's Duty's Burden, which you can swap out a mastercrafted auto or stalker bolt rifle for. It upgrades the weapon to a 30-inch range, rapid fire 2, strength 5, AP -2, damage 2 bolt weapon. It's not too bad to be honest. It's certainly good to put a few extra bolt shots down the range, but do bear in mind that the weapons that it's replacing aren't too bad in themselves either, so it's whether or not you think it would be worth paying an extra CP for that slight increase in damage. Secondly, and in my opinion far better, is the Fist of Vengeance. This basically turns a standard power fist into a Thunderhammer on steroids, because it turns the D3 damage of the power fist to a flat 3 damage, and it doesn't have the negative to hit modifier that a Power Fist or Thunderhammer normally has. So you're essentially turning a 9-point upgrade into a weapon that's better than a 40-point upgrade. So if you're building a Crimson Fist Smash Captain, it probably makes more sense to put this on him, rather than pay the points for a Thunderhammer, as you can save yourself over 30 points and also have a better weapon to boot. Plus you have the nice fluffy advantage of having a massive Power Fist on a Crimson Fist model, and what could be better? Finally, we have the special issue war gear. We have the standard ones, the Adamantine Mantle, that gives you a 5-up Feel No Pain save against incoming damage, Artificer Armour that gives you a 2-up save and a 5-up Invul save, Mastercrafted Weapon that gives +1 damage to any weapon that isn't a relic, and Digital Weapons that gives you 1 additional attack that if it hits causes a mortal wound. The unique ones from this codex are the Fist of Terror, which is another punchy power fist. This one unfortunately only does D3 damage, but you can make 1 additional attack with this weapon. And like the Crimson Fist's Relic Power Fist, it doesn't suffer the -1 penalty to hit. I think the Crimson Fist one is better if you can get it, but if not, then this one it certainly isn't too bad to run as an Imperial Fist or their successor. Next we have Gatebreaker Bolts. You fire 1 attack with a bolt weapon, and if it hits, then you make D3 wound rolls. Each wound roll is resolved at AP -5 and only 1 damage. This is very underwhelming for spending a CP to get a relic for, so I wouldn't bother again. Next is the Auric Aquila. This gives a 4-up Invul save and a 5-up Feel No Pain type save against mortal wounds, so it's not really much use on a captain, but if you wanted to put it on, say, a lieutenant or librarian, or another character that doesn't have an Invul save, then it could give them a little bit of a durability buff. And finally we have the Warden's Cuirass, which gives 1 additional wound to the model that has it. I'd say this is probably one of the worst relics of the lot. Any of the other durability relics are better and will do you better in the long run than just having 1 additional wound. Seriously, if you're ever going to take this, just take the Adamantine Mantle instead. For a 5 wound character, the Adamantine Mantle will, on average, save you an extra 2.5 wounds before the character dies. So frankly, it's just better. Time for Geokinesis now, so let's look through the psychic powers. Tectonic Purge is Warp Charge 6, and causes enemy units within 12 inches of the Psyker to subtract 2 from their charge roll. I think that this is a bit rubbish. The enemy can just choose to charge from somewhere else that isn't within 12 inches of your Psyker, and it might well not stop the charge anyway. I wouldn't bother with this as a psychic power that you have to manifest in the turn before anticipating a charge and then go and put your Librarian on the front lines. Not a good power in my opinion. Secondly, we have Rack and Ruin, which is Warp Charge 6, which I like a bit better. You can either target a building or an enemy unit that is entirely within a terrain feature. You roll 9d6, adding 1 if the target is a building, and on each roll of a 5-up, the enemy unit takes 1 mortal wound. On average, that will mean that there's 3 mortal wounds per time that you cast this, so it's a fair bit better than Smite, provided you can get it off on enemy units in cover. Now this is quite situational, but it does have a decent damage output, and even if it just makes your opponent abandon cover, then if you're Crimson Fists, then you've just denied your opponent a cover save. Next up we have Iron Inferno, which is Warp Charge 6. You select a point within 18 inches of the Psyker, you roll 1d6 for each enemy unit within 6 inches of that point that you've chosen, and each one suffers a mortal wound on a roll of a 4-up. I'm not really the biggest fan of these powers that just do 1 mortal wound, possibly to a whole bunch of units, as it's very unlikely to change the game in many meaningful ways. Still, it could be worth it if you have a whole bunch of enemy units clustered up. It could do potentially 3 or 4 mortal wounds on a good day. Maybe one to bear in mind if your opponent's running lots of small units. Next up we have Fortify, which is a cheap little healing power at Warp Charge 4. You restore d3 lost wounds to 1 Imperial Fist infantry or biker model within 12 inches. Unlike an apothecary, you can't get a model back up with this healing power. It's probably best used on something with multiple wounds such as aggressors or centurions, and Imperial Fists certainly have enough synergies with Heavy Bolter and Hurricane Bolter Centurions that it's not even funny. I would consider this just literally as an extra healing power if you are running Centurions somewhere in your list. Next we have Aspect of Stone. This adds +2 to the Psyker's strength and toughness until the start of your next psychic phase, so essentially just makes him a little bit more fighty. It doesn't exactly make him very fighty though, so this is probably worth just using if your enemy closes in on you, but maybe not to actually go out and deliberately seek out close combat. Bear in mind you could also fail this at a critical point if you really wanted him to be. +2 strength and toughness all game, though it is only Warp Charge 5. Finally we have Chasm for Warp Charge 6. You select an enemy unit that's within 18 inches of the Psyker, and the enemy unit can't fly. You roll 2d6, and you compare the result to the target's movement characteristic. If it's less than the model's movement characteristic, then they suffer 1 mortal wound. If it's equal, then they suffer d3 mortal wounds, and if it's more, then they suffer a flat 3 mortal wounds. Now this is probably best against infantry, particularly more slow moving ones such as Terminators, Aggressors, Centurions, that sort of thing, as it gives you a very good chance of doing a flat 3 mortal wounds. Certainly one to think about picking up if you're going into a matchup that has a lot of those units. Now let's take a look at the Imperial Fists stratagems. Firstly we have Bitter Enemy for 1 CP. In the fight phase you can reroll any hit and wound rolls against Iron Warriors. Obviously a massive buff against these guys, but it's not going to come up very often. Next we have Close Range Bolter Fire for 2 CP, which is a handy little tool that you can use to get your bolter armed units out of combat a bit more easily. In the shooting phase, the unit armed with the bolt weapons changes its weapon type to pistol, so heavy bolters become pistol 3 weapons, bolters become pistol 1 weapons. Because it's so high cost, I would only use it on a big unit, such as say for example Bolt Storm Aggressors, who I believe might be able to fire twice if they'd remain still, Centurions armed with Hurricane Bolters and Heavy Bolters, or perhaps Intercessors with Auto Bolt Rifles. Could be a handy way of getting yourself out of a pinch if you're targeted by a big horde. Next up we have Bolster Defences for 1 CP. This is a once per battle stratagem. At the start of the movement phase, one of your Imperial Fists units that's entirely on or within a terrain feature gets +1 to their armor save as long as they remain stationary. Now this is a really powerful stratagem for a backfield camping unit. For example, if you had a unit of Devastators, then they would be as standard on a 1-up save in cover for the rest of the game, provided they remained where they were. But like many of the things in this book, this works absolutely amazing on Centurions. As they already have a 2-up save, they'll be having a 1-up save for being in cover, and then if you use this stratagem to give them an extra +1 to saves, then they'll be essentially on a 0-up save. so to even make them anything worse than their standard 2-up, you'll need to shoot them with something like a las cannon with AP -3, and even then you'll still be saving on 3s. This is a truly insane durability boost, but obviously you just need to make sure that unit is positioned perfectly, because if you want to keep that benefit, then you can't move them for the rest of the game. All in all though, a really good stratagem for 1 CP. I'd certainly consider using it on smaller units, particularly ones that might need to hold objectives, if you didn't have a better target for it elsewhere. Next up we have Bolter Drill. This is a 2 CP stratagem that doubles down on the Imperial Crimson Fists army trait. Basically when you're firing with bolt weapons, each 6 to hit will cause an additional hit. This stacks with the army's chapter traits, so if you're say firing a Stalker bolt rifle, each time you roll a 6 for that unit, it will hit 3 times rather than once. Like so many of these stratagems, it works best on enormous units, and very few units are more enormous than a whole bunch of Centurions with heavy bolters and hurricane bolters. This adds a further 25% boost to their damage on top of the boost that they already have for their chapter tactic, plus any buffs that they get from captains or lieutenants. If you really need this unit to hit incredibly hard for 1 turn, then I'd think about this, but the command point cost is pretty high, so it's probably not one that you're going to be able to do every turn. Next we have Sappers. This is 1 CP, and it gives a unit +1 to hit and wound against buildings in the shoot or fight phase. I'm afraid I can't remember the last time that I've played against an enemy with a building, so it's not that relevant to the vast majority of games that you'll play, but if you do happen to run into buildings, then it's good to remember that Imperial Fists are very good at knocking them back down. Now we have Stubborn Defense for 2 CP. This is a Maelstrom orientated one that's a bit weird. Basically you can't discard, storm or defend tactical objectives, but if you do achieve them then you'll score 1 additional VP for doing so. I see this as quite risky to be honest, because you could wind up with a lot of objectives that you've drawn that are in your opponent's half of the board with no way to get to them. But if you did get lucky, then you could draw a lot of cards on your own side of the board and roll in victory points. Seems like a nice way to make the game of Maelstrom a little bit more swingy, which is a bit unfortunate. Next we have Pain as a Lesson for 1 CP. This gives a unit a 6+ Feel No Pain for 1 phase. You can't use it on vehicles or servitors, so it essentially gives you a nice extra little bit of durability. If you've got a unit that you know is just about to eat loads of heavy firepower, such as say that enormous unit of death-dealing Centurions that you've got stood in the midfield, then this could give your opponent a further headache when trying to deal with them. Next we have Tank Hunters for 2 CP. This gives 1 Imperial Fists unit +1 to wound against 1 selected enemy vehicle model. This is quite pricey to be honest, although +1 to wound is a very good bonus. I wouldn't use this every turn, but if there's a target that absolutely needs to die, either in turn 1 or 2 of the battle typically, then this could just help you off that vehicle with absolutely no trouble whatsoever. Just with the amount of heavy bolter shots with 2 damage that Imperial Fists armors can throw out, giving them an additional +1 to wound will really help you shift vehicles. Next we have the Shield Unwavering for 2 CP. This gives an Imperial Fists infantry unit within 3 inches of the objective +1 attack and +1 save, but it only lasts until the start of your next turn. It doesn't last through your whole turn. So it's essentially a very much I will hold this objective and hold it very well type stratagem. This could be really good if you do have say a Defend Maelstrom card to score. You could put it on a whole bunch of intercessors, and plus they'll be a lot more fighty if something does charge in to hit them in close combat. However, like most of the other combos we've discussed, you can also put this on a Centurion Death Star. If you've got bolstered defences plus this on a Centurion unit in cover, then they will effectively have a -1 up save, which is a bit ludicrous, and it means that unless you have an AP -4 weapon, then those models are still going to be saving on a 2 up save. Now this one is a bit more of a pricey one at 2 CP, so you're not going to be able to do it every turn. But if you do have a unit that absolutely does need to survive till the next turn to cause your opponent a massive headache, then you can certainly think about it. It's an option that's open. Next we have Clearance Protocols for 1 CP. This allows 10 models in a unit to throw a grenade instead of 1. Now on most armies this will be really quite good, but on Space Marines, particularly with intercessors, you're going to be having a lot of very decent shooting anyway. By choosing to throw grenades you give up all of those very nice bolt rifle shots which are further buffed by the Imperial Fists bolter bonus from their chapter tactic. I'd say this is only good in some niche circumstances, and most of the time you're probably better just firing with your original weapons and saving yourself the CP. Some niche circumstances I can think it might be useful in would be, say, a 10-man unit of tactical marines that really want to try and attack a hard target, so they want to throw a whole bunch of crack grenades, something like that. You're really going to want to have an entire 10-man unit though if you're going to be thinking about this at all, otherwise it's just a little bit weak. Finally, for the Imperial Fists, we have the Praetorian's Wrath, which is once per battle, while in Devastator Doctrine, on modified 6s to wound with heavy or grenade weapons, get 1 additional AP. This affects the entire army, so it could certainly be very, very good in the early game, particularly on weapons such as heavy bolters, which are only AP -2, so you could have AP -3 heavy bolters when you're wounding on 6s with them. This could be one more thing that you stack on your list of buffs that you're giving your bolt weapons, and you should think about it in any turn that you're throwing out a significant amount of firepower. Now the Crimson Fists can use all of those stratagems already mentioned, but they also have a couple of their own, which are Slay the Tyrant for 1 CP, which gives you +1 to hit against a character unit. Could be good against, say, tank commanders, or if you isolate an enemy warlord and you absolutely need to kill it with 1 unit that's closest to it. 1 CP for +1 to hit with any unit with moderately good firepower isn't bad at all. Secondly, we have a Hated Foe. For 1 CP, this gives you reroll wound rolls against an orc unit, either in the shooting or the fight phase. Now this is only good when you're actually playing orcs obviously, but when you are, it's certainly something that you should be considering using every turn on whichever unit is shooting at them with the most bolt weapons. This really will help you thin the horde like nobody's business. In addition to these, they also get the generic Codex supplement stratagems that allow you to take 2 traits on your warlord for 1 command point. Gift of the Phalanx, which will give a sergeant a mastercrafted weapon, digital weapon, the Fist of Terror, or Gatebreaker bolts, and finally Champion of Blades, which gives an Imperial Fist successor access to one of the Imperial Fists only relics, and this can include the Crimson Fists, if they wanted to buy in the Eye of Hypnoth, which in my opinion is probably the best relic in the book. So bringing it all together, Imperial and Crimson Fists are armies that want to be spamming out as many low strength, high rate of fire, heavy weapon shots that they can. Particularly heavy bolters are the absolute best weapon out of the entire book if you can get as many of them as you can. Because their high rate of fire, it means that the additional +1 damage against vehicles will double their effectiveness against vehicles, and because their high rate of fire, it means that they will be exceptionally punishing when you're fighting against hordes. Good units to use are, as I've said many times, the Centurions with 2 heavy bolters and a Hurricane bolter, because that's a lot of bolt shots. Bolt Storm Aggressors, Intercessors with any of the bolt rifle variants, those Stalker bolt rifles do get the +1 damage against vehicles buff. Redemptor Dreadnoughts with their Onslaught Gatling cannons. Stormhawk Interceptors with 2 heavy bolters, the Icarus Storm Cannon, and Twin Assault Cannons. Basically every Space Marine weapon that you can possibly get that is heavy and has a strength between 5 and 7 is absolutely brilliant for the Imperial Fists. In particular, that Centurion Death Star that we've talked about a few times. I've seen many other people across the internet commenting on how much damage you can get out of it. You can stack defensive buffs, giving it -1 up save that we mentioned earlier in the review, and you can stack aggressive buffs on it, such as Chapter Master bonuses, Lieutenant rerolls, and Bolter Drill to get an insane amount of firepower out of them. Furthermore, these guys can be in the Siegebreaker detachment for the Imperial Fists, where there exists a stratagem to get them to dish out mortal wounds to vehicles on rolls of 6. I'll be covering that in another video shortly, but this just essentially means that this unit can insta-delete virtually any vehicle in the game if it gets in range. They're certainly one to look out for, and I believe that we'll be seeing them in tournaments sometime soon. If you'd like to see an example list that I've come up with for Imperial Fists, I posted one yesterday, and I'll put a link down in one of the comments below. And I'll post the list on screen now, just as a general idea. The changes that I've made from yesterday would be to swap the Primaris Lieutenant to a Eye of Hypnoth, and I've used the spare points to pick up a Chaplain to potentially give the Centurions +1 to wound. Now more than ever, all of those command points are incredibly useful, and I'd probably spend most of them on buffing up the Centurion star, and I'd most certainly take the Siegebreaker detachment out of the Vigilus book if Games Workshop don't choose to change or nerf any of the stratagems in the coming FAQ, which I'm sure we'll see 2 weeks from the release of this codex. Essentially, my draft list focuses on an absolute ton of strength 5 firepower, and even without the mortal wounds should be able to munch straight through any vehicles it encounters due to an insane amount of strength 5 damage to weapons. But like I said, if you'd like to see the full list review, then please check out the video I left yesterday. I think I'll leave it there for this video. If I've missed anything, made any mistakes, or underestimated anything, please tell me down in the comments below. I'll try and leave some timestamps so people can better navigate through the video, and I'll certainly be looking out to see what sort of things start to come up in people's armies in the future. It'd be nice to see some more Crimson Fist armies out there, particularly as they can access the vast majority of the rules from this book, but only time will tell, I guess. Thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see more Space Marine content like this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.